Hey everybody, this is Rob and welcome to my latest live stream on infrared photography. In this live stream, I've got a bunch of submissions lined up. So we're going to cover, we're going to talk about using polarizers with infrared. We're going to talk about white balance. Everybody's favorite subject with infrared is talking about white balance. We're going to talk about camera conversions and filters and all kinds of stuff. Plus, I've got an absolute ton of images to look at, some images to edit, some images to critique, some follow-up images from previous live streams. So we've got a lot to cover. So I'm really looking forward to getting into it. Welcome to everybody who's joining in the chat. Let me know where you're viewing from in the chat. If you're interested in learning more about live stream about infrared photography, then I'd really recommend that you check out my book. Color Doesn't Exist, because color does not exist. It's a pigment of your imagination. This is a 320-page tome of everything that I've learned about infrared photography. So lots of great information, and it can be really helpful to you if you're learning infrared or if you'd like to use it as a reference. It is organized by a whole variety of topics, including some of the foundations of infrared. We talk all about equipment in here, different considerations when shooting, and a ton of stuff about editing. So lots of great information here. If you'd like more information, check out infraredbook.com, and you can learn all about it there and read all the reviews and everything. So be sure to check that out. All right, so let's dive in here. Welcome, Peter, from Belgium. Ooh, pretty late there this time. So thanks for staying up late for us. So let's dive into some images, because that's what I've got coming up first, is some images that I want to cover. So let me pull these up. The first images are from Alexandr, and he sent in a variety of images that we can take a look at. Let's see here. There are 3 images. Okay. So let me get that pulled up here. All right, so let's take a look at the images that Alexandr sent in. So these are raw images. So we'll take a peek. We'll take a peek under the covers and see what's happening here, looking at these in Lightroom. So by default, and I'll show you. I'll do a reset here. This is how they came to me default. So set with the camera monochrome version 2 for this camera. So that's probably like an Adobe standard profile. And this is a really interesting image. So when I first saw this image, of course, my first instinct was, oh, does this need do I need to correct the horizon, to get things level? But then the more I looked at it, the more sort of precarious it all felt. And I actually think leaving it a little tilted adds to some of the anxiety in the image. So let's take a look at what this looks like from a color perspective. So if I switch over to color, we can see here's Adobe Color. So by default, it's going to be very red, of course. We can start to see a little bit more detail in the shadows. If I switch to one of the infrared temp profiles, these are from the infrared profile pack. So you can get those from my website, blog.robsheaphotography.com. Look for the infrared profile pack. I've got profiles for hundreds of cameras available. So we'll take a look at selecting one of these profiles and then trying to set a custom white balance. Now, in an image like this, you've got artificial lighting and not a lot of color. So there may not be much going on here in terms of color and in terms of trying to do a color swap. And so even if I do a white balance here, you can see I'm getting these green tones and a little pink in the distance, and definitely if I pulled up the color swap profiles for these, you'd see these are really just some interesting variations on purples and greens. So I don't think that this is really interesting. So I think that the original instinct to go black and white is definitely the right approach for an image like this. Now, one of the things that I would normally do is pull up the B and W group in Lightroom and maybe take a look at some of these. So you could see just by selecting a different profile, you can get a radically different treatment. Some of these will bring up the shadows more, but you know, I like the mystery of this image. So maybe picking a profile that retains some of the mystery, I think, is really interesting. So I would pick a profile. Ooh, some of these are kind of interesting. So they add like this adds almost like a bit of a film look to it with kind of the tones. So my first step in processing an image like this would be to select the profile and then work from here. You've got no sky to work with. You've got no colors to worry about. And so you could just focus on the tones and the gradations. And so maybe, you know, looking at, you could certainly do masking to pick up individual elements. We could look at the amount of contrast we want. You could play with all of the basic tone settings, looking at textures and clarity and whatnot. So I would, you know, that right there, you could see a lot of additional detail coming out in the image, and that's really interesting. So I really like this image, and I think that it's got a very kind of spooky feel, a little bit of anxiety with these boards and the uncertainty of the space below. Maybe not the kind of thing I would want to walk across, but I really like this image. But definitely would approach this with kind of a monochrome treatment along these lines. So next up from Alexandr is this nightscape. So let's take a look at this a little bit. I'll reset this. This is the original sort of rendition that it came in as. So let's take a look at what I would do to begin to edit an image like this. So again, first thing would do to be pick one of the infrared temp profiles from the infrared profile pack, grab the white balance picker, and probably white balance here on this building, which is probably granite, some sort of granite. So we can now see that becomes white, and we've got looks like snow in the foreground, or maybe sand or snow, probably sand, and then starting to look like a blue sky. Now, in an image like this, you probably don't want to do a color swap either, because we've got, you know, what's already a bluish dark sky, and switching to another color doesn't make a lot of sense. So I don't think you need to do a color swap here. If I zoom in to some of these stars, you can see that the stars aren't dots, they're slight lines. And this happens with longer exposures. If I look over at the exposure here, let me zoom in here a little bit so you can see the exposure for this image is 46 seconds. And that's probably what's leading to some of this blurring of these lines. So first thing that I would recommend for the future, I mean, I love this composition, but if you're shooting astrophotography, make sure you're aware of the amount of time that your lens will keep your stars sharp as dots and not blur. And there's a calculation you can do for each lens. If you do a search for astrophotography, you can learn more about that. I would say probably you're going to be in the neighborhood with a lens like this of about half, so maybe 20 seconds, maybe 15 seconds would, I think, help with that reducing that amount of blur. And then you might have to either increase your ISO or potentially capture multiple images and do a stack. So let's look at editing some more. So let's go in and do some masks, and I will pull up the masking tool, and let's do a select sky and see what a select sky results in. So give it a second to think here. Pick up the sky, and now I can look and see what some of these settings will do. The first thing I'll come down and do is look at a dehaze, because that'll really bring out some of the dark blues in the sky and create some contrast with the clouds, and it helps the stars to pop a little bit more. Of course, you can really crank it up and get a severe look, but I would try to find a look that enhances the sky a little bit without being too severe. Maybe clarity is probably it's just gonna darken those corners, and I don't know if you're gonna want to do much texture. Let's see, texture would tend to bring out the noise, which would increase the number of stars you see, but you know, that may not be desirable. So maybe I will not adjust the texture. Now I could work on the ground separately from the sky. So I could do a click on this mask and do a duplicate and invert. So bring up the foreground. I could also clean up the edges here if I wanted to, using subtract and a brush, and clean those up a little bit. And here on the ground, I could try to decide what kind of treatment I want to do with the ground. Do I want to increase the contrast using the tone curve, or maybe adjusting the contrast here? So that would help. I think I want to bring out a little bit more of the texture in this building, and you could do that either through this mask, or maybe I could do a select subject and see if that would get me closer to masking out just the building. I think there's some really this granite. I love granite, and so when you can bring out some of the texture in it, and the contrast and the clarity, I think that's really interesting. So I think you've got a really great subject here, and doing some tweaks here. Now, of course, you could look at other things you might do in this image. So do I want to clean up some of the edges? You've got some items near the edge that might be distracting. There's a little bit of vignetting, which might be fine for this image, but I think this is one of those images that looks great in infrared, doesn't need a color swap, and just needs some sort of regular treatment. So great image. Let's move on to the next one from Alexandr. Let's see here. All right, here we go. So this looks like I'm going to say this is probably a 590 nanometer image. The others were probably the same, but it was harder to tell with being no sky involved in the first image, and then the second image being at night. It was a little harder to tell with the filter, but it seemed like there was enough color for that to be around a 590 nanometer filter. This one, most assuredly, as I can already tell by the color that I'm seeing in the boats here. So if I pick up this profile, the infrared temp profile, and then white balance on the clouds, then we can see this could be somewhere between a 590, maybe a 665 nanometer filter. I'm seeing a little bit of color in the sky, and I'm seeing some blue here in this boat. So hello to Anshul, who's joining us. I've got your images queued up here in a little bit. So I've talked about this in previous live streams, but these dust spots are something that you're going to want to tackle here. So I would probably go through the image and let's see, I might use the navigator here in the upper left hand corner to start up here, and then I'm going to quickly page down because you've got a few of them here. So I'll just hit this pretty quickly. I'm not going to be super precise here, but I would go through and clean up some of these spots. I'm using my mouse wheel to adjust the size of the circle here, and that allows me to do that quickly without having to adjust. I can use page up and page down to kind of cycle through the image very quickly. And I typically will do this if I see spots in an image and I want to clean up. This could be for dust spots. It could also be if there are maybe birds or other distractions in the image that you want to get rid of. Then I will commonly use this type of a technique. Oh, I'm actually at 200%. I usually do this at 100%. I'm really zoomed in on this one. So it'll get me through more dust at the edge. So something to be aware of when you have when you are changing filters, changing lenses, something we do a lot of in infrared, especially if you have a filter that sits between in the flange between your lens and your camera. Be sure to check those dust spots. You might want to get a blower. I've got one of those air blowers, and I've actually just been keeping it in my camera bag, not just in my office, but literally taking it out with me and turning my camera upside down and blowing the air out of making sure there's no dust on the sensor whenever I change the filter or change the lens. So definitely something to keep in mind. I find that to be really handy because this is, you can be careful, but there's just no getting around the nature of this stuff. All right, so we've got that. Ooh, look at all that cleaned up. The other thing I'm going to do here is, and of course I want to correct the horizon, but I'm seeing what could be a little bit of a hot spot here. And the reason I'm noticing this is because if you look at the center of your image, you'll see that either there's not as much color or there's a bit of a color shift that's happening. And if you look to the edges, you're seeing a lot more color. This is usually the sign of some kind of a hot spot in the lens. This could be from the lens itself. It could be from the aperture. This aperture is This is at f11. And depending on what camera you're using, let me switch over and see what camera this is for this image. This is a Canon RP. So this is a full frame camera. So with a full frame camera, you're probably not going to want to be shooting at f11, and there's a couple of reasons for that. So one is you might introduce a hotspot into the image depending on the lens, and then the other reason is that you might introduce diffraction. And with a full frame camera, you're probably looking at diffraction starting to creep into an image somewhere around f8. I would say probably f8. F8 might be safe. You might want to test it. For example, with my shooting, when I shoot infrared on my crop sensor camera, then I am trying to limit my f-stop to 5.6 or lower, or sometimes even f4 when I'm shooting deep infrared. And then with my medium format camera, I want to keep it to around f8 or lower, because I'll start to get diffraction at f11. And that might be the same case with a full frame camera as well. So you might want to keep it around 5.6, 5, 7.1, you know, whatever those settings are, 6.4, 7.1, and because you could get diffraction at that point. So that's just something to be aware of. So diffraction plus the hotspot could be affected by by shooting at f11 on a full frame camera. Okay, so let's get back to the hotspot and talk and address that. So I'm going to open up a mask and we'll do a linear gradient. Before I do that, let me do a tweak here that'll allow me to see these changes. So I'm actually going to I'm going to do a couple things, but I think when you look at a hotspot, there's two types of hotspots that you can correct. One is a brightness hotspot, and the other has to do with a color temperature shift. So let's deal with any brightness changes first, and then we'll come back and deal with a color shift. So I'm going to come into my mask, and I'm going to do a radial gradient, and I'm just going to kind of eyeball this. Sometimes I'll work from the center of an image. Sometimes I'll just focus on the sky where I think it's most prominent, where the challenges are. And then I'm going to look at adjusting the exposure. And the changes that you make for some hotspots, they tend not to be that dramatic. So I'm going to only do about 1/6 of a stop here, 0.16 over here on the right, you know, so not very much at all. Not very much of an adjustment, but let's leave that for now. And what I'm going to do is now I want to adjust the color. And I could certainly come down to the temp slider. That's where I'm going to make an adjustment. And if I go to the left here, you could see the hotspot, the center where my radial gradient is getting greener, bluer. And if I go to the right, it's going to get a little more orangey, yellowy compared to the rest of the image. But it's a very subtle change. So what I'm going to do is I'll go out of my mask, and I'm just going to turn the vibrance and the saturation all the way up, really burn out my eyes here. And now you can, even now, if I turn the mask off, then now you could see, so there's no mask here. This is how it was originally shot, with the vibrance and the saturation cranked all the way up. Now I can really see this hotspot in the center of the image. So now I can start to make adjustments, and you could see there's my image. So I probably want to do a couple things. So make this a little bit larger with a little bit more of a gradation, and then I could tweak I think I'm going to go even larger here because I want to feather into the change. And you could even sometimes use the edges of the image to start to line up where the feathering should be. So extend this out and make sure it's equal on both sides, if you're assuming that most hotspots are going to be centered in the image itself. So now that I've done that, now that I can play around with this temperature slider, and I can begin to try to match what's happening with the rest of the image. And it doesn't need to be perfect. So you can see here I'm at about 20 on the temp side, and I can just go back and forth a little bit and try to find a good match. And maybe even, you know, I might even go a little bit more on this one, depending to try to match it. So let's just find, I'll just pick a spot here. That looks pretty good. Now that I've done that, if I leave the masks and I go back and reset my vibrance and saturation, you're gonna have to let your eyes reset now because they're burned out with all that saturation. But now there's a more uniform color across the image that is easier to work with. So let me let me step away from that for a minute, and we'll do a level here. So I'll grab my angle tool, and I'll put it on the horizon on the left, and I'm just above the horizon, so I'll match that on the right, and get that leveled out. Okay, so now I've got some of my basic stuff done. I've got a white balance set. I have cleaned up some dust spots. I've taken care of a hot spot in the middle, and you can these are things you can go back and visit. I see a couple more hot spots. We won't worry about those. And now I can look at a color swap. So let's look at a color swap and pick up. I'm going to go to my IR color swap, and these are the Lightroom color swap profiles. You can find information about these on my blog as well at blog.robshayphotography.com. There are instructions there where you can build your own color swap profiles for Lightroom, or you can purchase them. Either way. And I've got a variety of color swapping options. So I can do a hue shift, I can do an invert, or I could do a channel mixer with a variety of adjustments to the green channel. So if I look at this, and really which one I pick, there's technical differences between them, but the one that I pick tends to be the one that based on the look that I want, the color that I want, not based so much on the technology. So let's look through these. This is the hue shift. So this gives us a kind of a natural blue sky, but pops a little bit of color here down in the ships, and then an invert. The RB, the red blue swap is just the red-blue channel swap. So this is going to give me a bit of a teal sky, a little bit surreal, but a little more pop of color in the other areas. If I shift the green channel to blue, I get this fun purple and yellow look. If I shift the green channel to red, then I get this sort of green, teal, red look. And then if I just split the green channel, this is a much more natural look for what the skies are. So this might be a very popular one. So then you could pick this. And then at this point, now that you've done this, now you're free to make any other changes that you'd like. Based on information from a previous live stream and a video that was shared, we know that we want to do our hotspots before we do too much in the way of masks, because sometimes the masking, or these hotspot corrections, can be a little weird when they're through a mask. And so it might be important to, based on the testing that I've done, it certainly validates that. So it could be really important to correct your dust spots first before you start doing a lot of masking. So now if we had this open and we go back to masks and did a sky selection, pull this up, and I've got a comment here from Peter. Hotspots are usually also related to the type of lens. Yes, absolutely. Hotspots. Yeah, and we can look at the lens that was used for this image. Hotspots will come in a variety of flavors. I would say roughly half of lenses have hotspots. Zooms tend to have more than primes, but primes can have them as well. The aperture can have an effect, so how open your aperture is. That's why in an image like this, f11 might make it more severe than it needs to be. And then the age of the lens. So lenses with certain coatings will have a tendency to have hotspots as well. So there's a lot of factors, but none of those by themselves are an absolute guide to say, oh, primes always have no hotspots, or vintage lenses always have no hotspots, although I haven't found many that have, but in general, you should still do some research. So let me do a sky here adjustment quick, and then we'll go take a look at what lens was used for this particular image. Looks like a 28 millimeter. I don't know if that was a prime or zoom. So let's adjust the sky. Usually I will add some dehaze to kind of create some drama in the sky. And now this might be if the mask that you made to correct for that hotspot didn't have a good sort of color gradation across the image, this might be a good time to revisit that, but I think it looks fine. And then we could do the same thing. We could either do if we want to address the rest of the image, we could either do a duplicate and invert mask to get the bottom, and then we could make adjustments there, or you could do a select subject to pick out the ships, or you could brush them, whatever your choice is. This is where you're going to spend a lot of time, so I'll add some texture and clarity to these. And then this is where I might, in some images, I might, visit, spend more time, either working on individual ships, or if I wanted to adjust the colors. Let's say, for example, I want the attention on that center ship, but this this tugboat on the right with the yellow is drawing my attention away. So maybe I want to desaturate some of these colors here. So this is the part where you can play around with the image and decide, you know, what you want to do, what you want to accomplish. But I'll spend most of my time on an image after I've done my white balance, after I've done my color swap, kind of doing these types of things to the image to get the look that I want. And this image could probably use a lot more contrast as well. I might even do that to the whole image, because you can see if we look up at the histogram here, we've got some flexibility. We could go to the tone curve, add some strong contrast, or you could add contrast through the slider. Either way. So, very nice image. Beautiful sky. The sky's a great compliment for this image. I love it. Let's go take a look at what the lens was for this particular image. Oh, this was a Tamron 28 to 300, f3.5 to x6.3. That's interesting because so a zoom lens, definitely zoom lenses have the potential to have hot spots. This is an extreme zoom, so that's quite a flexible lens, and to have such a minor, I guess you'd almost say, hotspot with such a zoom lens means it's probably a good lens for infrared. But again, I might use a lower aperture just to avoid those hotspots. Hey Adam, how's it going? So those were the images from Alexandr. Very nice. So let's switch over and let me figure out what's next here. Let's see. So next up, I had a question that was submitted from Rita, which is, will a circular polarizer enhance tonality when using a converted camera like a normal camera? So I don't have a great answer for this yet. I did some tests last year with a circular polarizer on an infrared camera, and I was trying to evaluate how much impact that they would have. You know, I'd done some tests with neutral density and explored that, and that was really interesting, because if you get a neutral density filter that supports infrared, not just any neutral density filter, but one that's designed for infrared, you can get great results just like you would shooting neutral density for visible light photography. And a polarizer, I wanted to see if it would do the same thing. So I did a number of tests, but my tests were at the time were focused on glare and trying to explore glare, and I took a whole bunch of test shots, and I could not find any differences. Now, again, that was focused on glare. I'd like to do another series of tests that is more focused on other subjects aside from, you know, in this case it was light on water, light reflecting off water. I'd like to try some subjects that are not that, to see if I get any result and see if there's any value in it. Theoretically, I would think that a polarizer would have the same effect. But again, the challenge with some of these filters is that if they're calibrated for visible light and they're not calibrated, or they don't support infrared, then they might not have the same effect. So more testing to come, and hopefully I'll have a better answer for, and probably do a video if I can get good answers on what we could do with a circular polarizer in infrared. All right, let's move on to a series of images that were submitted by Thomas. So let me pull up, we got a couple images from Thomas. Let me find these from the submissions here. Okay, here we go. So a couple nice looking images. And let me switch over to back to Lightroom, and we'll pull these up. So here's the first one from Thomas, and let's take a look at let's go ahead and take a look at some of those settings first, and see what we're dealing with here. So we have a Sony A6400, and this looks like a Sony E lens, the 28 to 75 2.8. There's no we don't know what filter was taken, but I think we can get a pretty fair guess just kind of looking at the image. So so let me do a white balance, and then I'll share what I think about what kind of filter we have. So the first thing that I'll do is pick one of the infrared temp filters and get that set up. And actually we're pretty close here. So this might have been custom white balanced in the field. Because the as shot version looks pretty well balanced, but I'll do a little double check on the clouds here, a little bit of a shift, not that much. And honestly, you know, the white balance is really a your prerogative. So, for example, in an image like this, you could see the two things that I'm looking at. This is what I think about when I'm white balancing. Normally, I want something neutral to be neutral, so clouds, rocks, dirt, bare tree trunk, something along those lines. But the other two things that I'm looking at are balancing the golds in the sky with the blues in the trees. And let me show you what I mean by that. So if I come over to the temp slider, in addition to using the picker to, select different subjects, I could use the picker on the ground, and that would give me, maybe I'll use my W key to get to it faster. The rocks might give me one tone, and the ground might give me another tone, and the clouds would be different. If I go over to the slider, if I go to the lower color temperatures, now I'm emphasizing the blue. So I'm getting a much richer blue in the trees. That's going to almost desaturate the sky because the blue's kind of canceling out the gold that's there. Now, after a color swap, this is going to produce a different result. If I go to the high end, we're going to get the opposite. I'm going to favor the skies and the color in the sky. And then I'm going to almost lose the blues that exist here in the trees. And of course, then I'll have that color tint to some of the neutral tones. Let me show you what I mean by that after we do a color swap, because that'll be really informative as well. When I think about it, this is probably the filter on this. I'm going to say this was probably like a 720 nanometer filter. I'm not seeing a lot of color saturation in here, so this looks like to me like about a 720. So let's do a color. Let's see if I've got color swaps for this. I do. And so let's pick some of these. Let's just pick kind of a standard one. I'll just pick let's do an invert. So that'll give me a good result. Okay, so this is the invert, and this is white balanced on the clouds. So now if I go back to that temperature slider, let's look at the difference. This is one of the things that I really like about the color swap profiles, because when you have to lock in a white balance, go to Photoshop and then do your swapping, you're losing the ability to make this kind of a tweak and to see the results of it. Yes, you could go back into Camera Raw and make a tweak, but here you get to see it live on the fly. So now if I make adjustments to the white balance, and let's go to the left again, so you can see I'm losing that color saturation in the sky, but I'm gaining that yellow tone throughout the image. And remember, because we're swapped, the colors you see on the meter here are not going to reflect the image. I'm going to the blues in the low end, and I'm seeing more yellow in the trees. So if this was if this was a look you wanted in your image, maybe you were looking for a golden hour type look or something, and you didn't care so much about the blues in the sky, but you wanted to emphasize the color of the trees, then this would be one way you could do that. Or if I would drag the other way, back towards what that normal was, around 5,000-ish. If I go into the higher, again, this is going to be yellows over on my temp slider, but it's going to give me those cooler looks of the image. So if I wanted something that looks cooler, like almost like a nighttime look or a wintry look, then I could do that. So this is one of the things that I really like about having the color swaps right in Lightroom, is that I can set a white balance, I can color swap, but then I can tweak the white balance to get a variety of looks. And that gives you a lot of flexibility. You don't yes, you'll frequently see me say something like, white balance on a neutral, like a cloud or the ground or something. And that's very common, but you're not limited to that with infrared. You can play around with this slider to change colors here. You could even play around with the green and purple tint and see if one of those is interesting to you. Remember, a lot of the look that happens with infrared has a surreal look to it. So you can definitely take advantage of that in the colors that you're selecting. So let me, not having said that, let me go back and kind of look at this from a conventional perspective. We've got our colors picked here, and I can, let's maybe go into the tone curve here and increase the saturation a little bit. You can kind of decide, one of the things you'd have to decide in an image like this is how much of this, you've got a little bit of the ground here that's interesting. I almost wish, I don't know what was to the right of this image. I don't know if there was a curve here that would have kind of completed that look. That might have been interesting. But, you've got to kind of decide what you want to see in a composition. A lot of times when I'm doing a vertical composition like this, one of the things I'll do I'm going to hit the R key to go over to the crop section, and I will then pick frequently a 4x5. Now, why 4x5? Well, frankly, it's because of Instagram. 4x5 is a nice crop that works well with Instagram, and so because of that, I will tend to focus on that. Now, if I was doing a print or something else, I would probably be more willing to explore different crops. But if I'm simply focusing on Instagram, a lot of times for vertical images, I'm going to look at a 4x5, and then now I can decide, what do I want? Do I want to get more of that trail up at the top and do a crop like this, or do I want to capture some of the ground? It really depends on what you want the focus of the image to be. So for now, let me keep this. I'll hit the R image, so we'll get a little bit of that trail, but we'll kind of retain the focus on the trees themselves. So let's go into the masks and do a select sky. We can still get a little bit more contrast out of the sky, maybe pull a hint more color out. You can do that with dehaze. You can also do that with the tone curve that's now available in Lightroom masks, and pull that in to create some contrast. So that creates a little bit more punch, and a lot of takes the highlights to this white up pretty high. And then we can look at the rest of the image. So here you could do an invert like I've done in the past, duplicate an invert, or you could do separate masks for different parts of the image. Let's say I wanted to separate out and just focus on the trees here. I could do a subtraction and a radial gradient. And let me zoom out a little bit. So we're going to try something different here. I want to cut out the lake, if you will. And so I could come down here with a subtracted radial gradient, and I could do something like this and play around with this to get to the point where it sort of matches. You could do this with a brush as well, but here I could use this to kind of cut out the impact on the lake, and then now the brush is this mask is only going to affect predominantly the trees and the ground. So now if I make adjustments to, could be texture, could be clarity, maybe I want to adjust the contrast, I could do that through the tone curve, or I could do that through the contrast slider. Either way, you can adjust the saturation. So a lot of times when you think about, when I think about the different filters that are available for infrared, anything from, even an orange filter like a 550, 590, 665, 720, the major difference is, yes, you're capturing different amounts of visible light. They're going to result in different amounts of color, but you still have control afterwards to make a change. So a lot of times, maybe I'll take a 590 nanometer image and I'll desaturate it to make it look more like a 720. You could do the same in reverse. I could add more color to a 720 image to make it look more saturated and give it a little bit more life. So there's different approaches that you can take. You can do that here in the mask, and you can adjust color differently for the trees, the sky, whatever you like. So this is a very what I really like about this image is the focus on the clouds. Sometimes clouds can be a really dominant feature in your image, so definitely be aware of them. They're going to stand out more. Sometimes clouds will look a little bit hazy when you're out shooting, but once you get back to edit, you can really make some things punch. And then if you've got like a trail like this, you can really do a lot with it. So this is the image from Thomas. Let's take a look at the second image that he had provided. Oh, so this one's really cool. I really like this image. So you've got some sky here, nice clean sky. We've got a really strong architectural structure here, and we've got some really interesting foreground. So I love images like this. I love the contrast. Infrared, I think, is really great at producing a contrast between man-made subjects like architecture and then natural subjects. And so an image like this is definitely an area where we could take a look at that. So let's look at the pick up a profile, and I'll do a quick white balance here, maybe under the eaves here. And that'll get me a nice baby blue in the trees and a nice yellow tone in the sky. So for an image like this, I could use a sky filter here, but there's not a lot going on in the sky. The other way that you can address color, well, let me do a color swap first, and then I'll come back to addressing that. So let me go to my color swap profiles and look at these. See, we've got just the differences between these two variations produce wildly different looks of the sky, and then different looks depending on which of these that you pick. I'm going to go with this, the channel mixer red blue swap. I love the teal look of the sky. So let's take this, and maybe I want to just tweak. I could play around with the color a little bit. Let's do a little bit more with that as we get into the specific subjects. So let's mask this and see what a select subject looks like. First of all, I'm going to hope for the house. So I would start with a view of the house here, and then I would probably, that's actually pretty good. I might take a image like this and maybe clean up some of the edges. So do like an add brush, and then you could maybe brush in some of the edges. So again, spend all the time you need to get these edges cleaned up. I could also subtract to take out, oops, let me undo that. I could subtract brush to take out these rocks. So be sure to spend the time you need to get your masks right. But now that I've got that, I can come to this and I'll punch up the contrast in this with a lot of texture and clarity, see what those reflections look like in the windows, maybe even a little dehaze on this, add a strong curve. You don't have to use these presets. You could design this curve yourself, but I'm going to go quickly here. Maybe I'll go to a medium here. That's the strong was a little bit much. So create some punch there. I might bring up the shadows just a touch in this. I want to bring out some of the texture here underneath. Okay, so I think that looks pretty good. Now, the other thing that you can do once you've got your subject selected is you can also start to adjust color temperature. So I could look at what's going to happen with this temp slider. Now, remember, my colors are swapped, so the actions I take will be reversed. So if I thought there was too much of, for example, a certain tone in the building, like let's say I thought there was too much of a yellow tone, I could take this to the right to cool it off. So you can see how I'm losing some of those reflected lights, especially in the shadows. So I actually kind of like that to cool it off a bit. Now let me create a linear gradient, and I'm going to pull up from the bottom of the image. And again, you could brush this, you could be really precise, but we'll do a linear gradient for this one. And I want to create some more contrast here. I can do that in the tone curve. I can do that with the contrast slider. And I can decide how much texture and clarity that I want. Now this is challenging because if you add a ton of texture and clarity, then you might be competing with the house. So think about what you want your viewers to be looking at. You could also go the other direction. I could take the texture and the clarity and I could reduce them, and I could soften up the foreground to draw more attention to the precise look, the sharp look of that house. So you could play around with these to get the look that you want. I don't know if I would do that too much, but I could do a little bit, maybe if I want to just kind of ease back on that. I could also adjust the exposure a little bit if I wanted to draw focus. So maybe just a hint down of exposure, then especially some of these highlights here, I could also bring the highlights down. Then that will, again, bring my focus back to the house. So I could do a select sky, and I really like this. This actually kind of reminds me of an image that I took at Alcatraz that had a similar, it wasn't a new building, of course, it was one of these decaying buildings in Alcatraz, but it had a very similar foreground with these craggy rocks and foliage growing on it, and then you had a building, and then you had a sky, and I love the contrast of all of those three elements, the depth that creates. So this is a very nice image. So thank you, Thomas, for sharing that image with us. Okay, so let's go back and see where we are next. Peter said, I'm amazed at the relative good quality and outcome of the cheap 28 to 300 Tamron. Yeah, I am too. Sometimes you never know. It may be a fluke. Maybe there's not as many coatings used in a lens like that. And this is why it's so important to do research and look up the specifics for different lenses. Okay, so let's see. Next up. So next up, we had a question from Andrew, and Andrew had a question that was, can you please tell me why, when setting the white balance of a raw image, Affinity Photo increases the temperature to 25,000 Kelvin, and, excuse me, on one raw reduces it to below 2,000 Kelvin. Let me take a drink here. All right. I love talking about white balance. So let's think about this a little bit, and then I want to share a little bit something. So the thing, welcome to Patrick and Fandyus. Thank you for joining. The thing that's interesting, I want to share some interesting tidbits about white balance, and then I want to talk a little bit of science. But don't worry, there won't be any math involved. I might scare you with a formula, but you won't have to do anything. The interesting thing about white balance, if you think about it, is your camera does not really know the white balance of the subject it is capturing. The camera, if you look at, your standard visible light photography, it's got all these presets for white balance. It's got daylight, it's got tungsten, it's got overcast, and all these things. These are presets that will set a fixed white balance. But we don't know. Your camera doesn't know. It's just setting a fixed one. What does that mean? If you do an auto white balance, it's trying to guess, almost kind of like exposures, trying to guess how much light is hitting a scene. But again, it's a guess. Your camera doesn't really know what the white balance is of your subject. I mean, this is why we shoot raw, because we want to be able to adjust this afterwards, because frankly, we don't trust the camera. We don't trust the camera to get a good white balance, especially in infrared. You could probably trust it for a lot of visible light, but you don't want to trust it for infrared, so we shoot raw. And this gets into the nature of something called illuminance. So let me share a little something with you, and I want to talk a little bit about why these different cameras can end up with such dramatically different results. And the reason for this has to do with a scientist named Max Planck. So let's talk about what Max did. Max, you may have heard of some of the other things that he's done, but one of the things he created is called a Planckian locus. And this is really interesting. If you look at this color space, this may be familiar to you. This color space is a two-dimensional representation of the colors that are available. And in fact, if you look, there's some interesting things here. Let me zoom in on this a little bit so we can take a look at this more closely. So a couple interesting points here. First of all, if you look around the edge where these numbers are, these are actually the light hitting in different wavelengths in nanometers. So 700 is red, 590 is orange. Now we're getting into the greens through a large range of bandwidths, and then blues, indigos, and violets. So we've got all of these colors represented around the edge. But what's this line in the middle? This line in the middle here has a number of numbers as well, and it represents the color temperatures that exist. And the color temperatures, as you can see, they actually land at different places within the color space. So everything from on the say a tungsten of about 2800 here would be here in the orange, all the way to a daylight of around 5600 would be somewhere here closer to the middle, closer to whites. This is a two-dimensional representation, so we can't capture all of this. But this is a curve that exists within a color space. It's actually a curve that exists within a three-dimensional color space. So when a camera is setting one of these, and then we accept it as the value it is, that's what we've captured. But when we want to make an adjustment to white balance after the fact that it's captured, now we have to move somewhere along this curve. How do we do that? Well, first of all, if you're a software developer who's creating a raw editor, these are actually things you have to think about. And you have to look at formulas like this and say, oh my goodness, how do I calculate, how do I calculate these values? Because these are the kind of formulas as a part of Planck's locus, this Planckian locus that you have to use to actually calculate where you fall into a different color. If I look at this image, you can see as it cycles through the different color balances. Of course, these are visible light. We're not even getting into infrared, but you can see the different values that exist that we're trying to guess. So if I come down here to, this chart, this is a really good, let's see here. I think, yeah, this is a really good chart, because this one, kind of like that first one, it shows the color space, but it shows the different things. So if I look at this A here, that's marked on the screen, this is tungsten. This is about 2800 Kelvin. This is a tungsten source. And if I look farther down the line, you can see some default color spaces. So you've got things like D55, which is actually a standard for a light source at 5500 degrees, or D65. These are some industry standards for how we measure light. Okay, so, but back to the question, how does one program say that a color is 2000 and another program say that exact same color is 2500? Well, the challenge is whether that program uses a single illuminant or dual illuminants. And what do I mean by that? A single illuminant would be like a JPEG. I've captured a JPEG. It's got one color and it's locked in. It's captured the illuminant that the camera had set. So whatever your preset was, that's what's captured. And now you have a single illuminant, a single light source that defined the color of that image. If you want to do a calculation, now you're just moving off of that illuminant in different directions. And this is why when you're in a JPEG image, you're going to see a blue yellow tint and a green magenta tint, because you're basically moving in 2 dimensions off of that single illuminant. So it's difficult. So a program that works off a single illuminant, it's limited in what its capabilities are, and it has to do a lot of guessing to try to figure out what a good white balance is. But if you have a dual illuminant profile or camera, now you know the spot for 2800, you know what this A spot is, and you probably know the spot for, like, say, D5500. And because you know those 2 spots for this particular camera, and you know about the Planckian locus, now you can calculate this line that exists between the 2 of them. So this is how raw editors will calculate white balance in visible light photography. Now, the challenge for us in infrared is that if you continue down this line, you're down here at 1000 Kelvin, and of course, infrared light is about 900 Kelvin, which is like literally just off the edge of this. And so the challenge becomes more, while this is a well-known problem to solve for visible light, it becomes more challenging for infrared, because we're sort of off this curve. We're at the end of the curve. And so some programs don't know how to handle that. Some are better at handling it with the way that they guess. Some of them, like Adobe products, use dual illuminants. And so all the profiles that we create these profiles will allow us to shift. That's what the infrared profile pack does. Is it basically takes it uses these dual illuminants and it shifts us way down this curve in a way that makes it predictable for Adobe products. So that's why these shifts work so well in Lightroom and Photoshop. Programs that do not use dual illuminant profiles, they have to come up with their own method. And so that's why you see these differences between these different programs. I won't delve too much more deep into it, because I know not everybody's interested in like sort of the science here, but I find it very fascinating. And to me, it sort of explains, the background of why this is challenging, why it's challenging to set a white balance, why we have the situation we do with Adobe products, and we need to shift the profile. It's so that we can move along this curve, and why other programs don't have that and have to come up with a different method. And so each program that uses, back to the original question, why does one program give you one white balance and versus another? It's because they're using different methods. They're either using this curve to try to figure out what the white balance is, or they're using a different method that they've calculated using tints with a single illuminant to try to calculate it. And so the challenge for us in infrared is that leaves us, trying to figure out, what we need to do to get a good infrared image. Okay, so I find that stuff really fascinating, but I won't go any further. So I'm checking out the comments here. Is it okay to ask questions in the stream? Absolutely. That's why I'm doing this live, is so you can ask questions. I've got stuff that's submitted, and we will go over that. The last question here was from Andrew, by the way, who asked the question about the white balance with different programs. So thank you, Andrew, for submitting that. As you could tell, I'm just giddy with excitement talking about white balance and the technical stuff, but I don't want to lose y'all by getting too techy on it. But it's a fascinating subject for me. So thank you, Andrew, for submitting that question. I appreciate it. And yes, if you have other questions in the chat, please feel free to submit those. So in the chat, Anshul says, do you recommend any resources if I want to learn the science in depth? Well, I'll plug my book, because what I did in the book is I've got a section in the back of the book called, I'll show it, I'll see how well I can show here, called Further Reading. And this is kind of like, I've got a further reading section, and then I've got I also have like a kind of a bibliography in the back as well. And so these are two sections. I'm trying to show this without too much glare. So I've got a bibliography and I've got a further reading. And so I put these in the book because, well, for a couple of reasons. So that it's a source where I got a lot of my information, and so you can definitely check that out. But also, I think it's fascinating if you want to go deeper into the science. We just looked at a page on Wikipedia. Wikipedia is an amazing resource for information of this kind, all the science, optics, all kinds of stuff. I can really deep dive. And sometimes on some of my videos, like when I was doing videos on, say, diffraction, I'll deep dive into a bunch of pages on Wikipedia. In fact, the articles that I read there were able to point me to formulas that I then used to validate what I was saying about the relationship between aperture, diffraction, and wavelength, so that I could validate that wavelength had a greater the diffraction had a greater impact on infrared because of its wavelength. And the formulas that were available on Wikipedia that are kind of standard knowledge are, the kind of things that helped me to validate that. So the book's got a lot of great, it'll point you to directly to the topics if you're interested. Okay, so here's a question from Fandyus. Here goes. Have you heard of WavelengthPro? It's a free program that was never finished, but it has some really interesting functions, such as a really good aerochrome emulation. I have not, so I will have to check that out. Never finished. That's kind of interesting. Like was it available as a was it released as like open source in an unfinished form, or what is the unfinished part? So that's the part I'm really curious. I'm asking, since I personally found it amazing at processing photos taken with an orange filter. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, orange filters are great for lots of color saturation and really interesting colors. So definitely that's interesting. So let me make a note of WavelengthPro, and I can check that out. Okay, let me pull up some images from Ross. Ross did something cool here. He submitted images that were both, he sent me both RAWs and his process version. So we get to actually take a look at both of those. All right, so let's take a look. Let's find the images from Ross, and we can both, we can do an edit here live, and then we can look at what his version was and see what the differences are. So let me find these images. Let's see. Okay. Okay, let's see here. Okay, got them. All right, so let me pull these up. So let's see. What do I want to do first? Do I want to show you his interpretation or my interpretation? I'm going to do my... I actually really like his interpretations, and they're different than mine. So I'll do mine first, and then we'll look at his interpretation and compare them. So let me switch over here to Lightroom, and we will, let's see. So this was shot with a Canon PowerShot S100. Oh, I used to have an S95, and I loved that camera. So tiny, amazing. died prematurely, the screen, and I was always looking for a replacement for that, but I absolutely adored that camera. Let's see here. So let's see. Let's start with the sort of standards. So I would look at a infrared temp here to make an adjustment and pick a white balance. There's, we've got maybe the tree trunks are the best thing to do to pick a white balance here. I don't have much else. I could do the sky, but you see we're getting a little bit of a reflection here in the water of a yellow sky. The sky itself might be a little blown out. We might not be able to recover some of the detail there. And so, let's work with this white balance off the trees. And so this is an interesting image. When I have an image like this, again, I talked about it earlier, but when you don't have a sky, you don't have to. Well, I mean, you don't have to color swap anytime if you don't want to. But you definitely have a choice here whether you want to do that. Let's see. So let's see. S100 was my first camera. Amazing little thing, but I lost it. Yeah, those are. It was funny because I looked when my S95 broke. I looked to get it repaired, and it was probably more money to repair it than to just buy another one or to buy like an S100 or 110 or 120. But yeah, just love that little thing. I think what was amazing about it is for such a tiny. This was a Canon camera. For such a tiny camera, it actually captured raw files. And when I was getting deeper into photography, it was great to have a pocket camera that actually captured raw files, because then it gave me more control when I was editing. That was one of the things I really liked about it. Okay, so let's look at what some of my color swaps would be here. I don't have any direct color swaps. So, okay, that would mean that I could, one of the things I could do would be to go over to Lightroom. So let's take a look at this over in Lightroom. Let's just see in Photoshop. So let's go over to Photoshop and get some ideas of what this might look like and while this is loading up. And so Peter says, why not white balance off the leaves? So you can certainly do that. That's a viable choice. One of the things that I like to say, I think that white balancing on the leaves is a trend that started in the early days of digital infrared photography, back when the only filter that was commonly used was a 720, and the foliage tended to be white. Therefore, white balancing off the leaves make a lot of sense. But these days, there's a lot of other filters that are being used. You've got 665s, you've got 590s, the orange filter, like a 515 to a 550. These have a lot more color. And the challenge when you white balance off the leaves is that you're going to be skewing the image, because now you're white balancing on an area that's color and not an area that's neutral. And so you can certainly do that. I'm not saying you can't do it, but just be aware that if you're shooting anything other than a 720 nanometer filter and you're white balancing on the leaves, then you're skewing the image. You're skewing the color of the image, and it's going to affect other things. So just definitely something to be aware of. Okay, let's see if this thing is loaded up in Photoshop. Okay, so I've got this in Photoshop, and now in Photoshop, I'm going to look at my actions. So these are all available from my website. You can download. I've got the infrared actions. I've got 6 of these, and then I've got a bunch of extras. And these 6 actions are similar to the color swap profiles in Lightroom. So I could do just a regular RB swap and hit play, and then this would apply a color swap. And this could be the same thing. And what I would do if I'm experimenting in Photoshop and I want to try these different looks, what I'll typically do is I've got this first layer, and I knew that was this color set, and I'll hide this, and then I could grab the next one and hit play. That gives me another look. I could hide this, hit the next one, hit play, and then I could just use this to cycle through, and then I could look at the different colors that I like and pick the one that I found the most interesting. So let me just quickly do this. I've got this one is green to blue, so that's going to give me that yellow, maybe a little purple look. That one's kind of interesting. And I've got invert. And then invert and hue are going to be pretty similar in color. They're just going to give me different tonality. So that's my different looks, so that I could browse through these and find the look that I like. So I kind of like that pink. The pink's interesting, although you've got this very teal sky. And again, this is where I think the sky's blown out a little bit. So that's a little bit, I think it's blown out. That's a little bit challenging. But I don't know, maybe I'm going to go with this. Let's go with this color because this gives us probably the closest to a natural sky. So from here, I could go back to Lightroom, or I could continue to make edits here. Let's make some edits here. Let me add, and I'll just do this through adjustment layers. So I can go down here and I could pick a curves adjustment layer to add some contrast. And you can do the same things here you can do as Lightroom. I could apply these as to the entire image globally, or I could use a mask to apply this to portions of an image. But that's sort of beyond what I have time for in this session. But I could definitely pick up a curve here. Let me just do a quick auto, so that gives me a little bit of a sharp curve, and I can increase the contrast here. So let me let's see. I think I'm gonna save this, and maybe I'm gonna go back to Lightroom. The other thing you could do is you could pick up. You could go to the filter and do a raw filter. The challenge though is after you've come from Lightroom, you're not going to be working off. You're going to be working off what you have here, or maybe off of the lowest layer, and you're not going to be working off of Lightroom. And you got to be careful that you're not getting mixed up where you want to spend your time. If you have a workflow that you like switching between Lightroom and Photoshop, just be careful of where you save those changes. So I tend to prefer trying to stick all in one or all in the other, so that I'm not sort of getting mixed up with the different. Like you can see here, I've picked the wrong layer. I would have to go back and pick the bottom layer to be able to do this in Camera Raw here. Filter Camera Raw. Okay, and again, this is just going to give me the static of what was brought over from Lightroom. I'm not going to have any changes that I made in Lightroom. So that's where the challenge is. I like to keep all my raw editing in one place, either in Camera Raw before I've started, or in Lightroom. But for the sake of expediency, let's just make some edits here. So let me just, let me increase the contrast a little bit. Let me see if I can bring down the highlights. I don't think there's much sky to recover here. A little more contrast. So let me just kind of punch this up a bit. The other thing with an image like this is, I've got, what's my subject? I definitely have these interesting trees, but I also have people over here. Are they kind of blending in? Do I want them to stand out more? What do I want the subject to be? So when I look at an image like this, I start to think about, do I have the right aspect ratio? Should I crop this a little bit? Maybe crop some of this stuff out on the right. And where do I want to draw the focus to? These trees, of course, on the right are very lovely. And then, of course, the reflection in the water. And I think that's the most interesting part. Okay, so let me save that. That'll take me back over here, and I've got more contrast, so I can now see the image that I've got here. So let me now. So this is what I've done. I would probably get some color swap profiles over in Lightroom and maybe do the whole edit over in Lightroom. I think that would give me more control. I would probably bring up the brightness of the water. Try to bring up the exposure there. So, for example, if I did, hang on a second, I think I've got a sneeze here. Ooh, okay. So, let's say that I did an exposure adjustment, and I wanted to, or actually, let me do this. Before I do the exposure adjustment, let me just draw a quick, let's see here, draw a quick lasso. So let's say that I would take part of this image, and then I would do, and I'm doing this very rough, and then I would do an exposure adjustment. This will bring in with a mask, and now if I bring up the exposure, now I'm just going to bring up the water. And I could do the same thing with other settings. That's one of the things I like about Lightroom or Camera Raw over Photoshop, is that once I draw a mask, I mean, you could do it here as well, but I find it very easy to bring these settings around in different places. I could also do, let's see, I could do an invert of this. and I could bring down the levels at the top as well. So let me just draw a quick mask here and kind of do the same thing. Oops, I didn't catch all of the top, so let me make sure I've got that. And now I could, if I do another, let's do curves for this one. So now if I do curves, I could bring down this, or maybe add a little bit more contrast or drama to the image. So again, the tools are similar, but it really depends on your preferences. Do you want to work with layers here in Photoshop, or would you prefer to work over in Lightroom? So here's the version that I'm getting close to. I would probably refine some of these edges a bit and maybe do a little bit of a crop. Let's see the version that he came up with. So this is, this is amazing. And again, like I said earlier, way off where I think I'm at. I think there's much more of a painterly feel to this. Definitely high saturation, so amping up the colors, taking advantage of the white balance, so not limiting yourself to the white balance. It looks like there might have been a little bit of a clouded sky kind of added in to deal with that blown out area. And then using the white balance. I think the white balance is really interesting in his choices here, because it draws, because there's more of a blue tone here in the center, it really draws your eye into this space, and it brings out the people more. In my personal work, I've been shifting away from this sort of high saturation look, but I actually think it really, really works in this image. So I really like what you've done here. Okay, let's move on to the next one. So this is, let's see, this is the, this is the raw. So let me reset this. So this is the raw that came in. We'll kind of do the same thing. So if we go through the standard process, and I'll do this kind of quickly, set a white balance here, and let's set a quick level, a little bit. All right, and then I'll go down to color swap, and no color swaps again, probably the same camera. Here's the other thing you can do to get a quick color swap. Let's do this so we can kind of keep this whole thing in Lightroom. I can come down here, I can set a mask. I've shrunk my image. I can do a linear gradient, hold down the shift key, drag outside the image. Now I've basically selected the whole image, and now I can do a hue shift right here in Lightroom without any color swap profiles. So this is another option that I have available, and then I can go back to fit, and now I can work from the image, doing color swaps. So now at this point, I can play around with sky. There might be, I don't know how much sky there is. Yeah, there's a little bit of clouds there. That might be worth trying a quick mask in the sky to kind of see what I could pull out of it. Infrared's really interesting in what it does with the sky. That's one of the things I really like about it, is the way that it can take a kind of a hazy sky. There's days when I'll go out and I'll think, oh, it's just hazy out, there's nothing here. And then I'll go out and maybe shoot some deep infrared, and then I can really punch up the skies, and it just separates out all the clouds from the sky. And I really like what that does. Let me do a select subject. You've got a really interesting subject here. We've got this really strong monument, and it's got like it looks like some interesting coloring, that maybe some degrading that's happened. So a select subject, it gave me this tree in the background. I'm going to do a subtract brush, and we'll quickly just brush this out. Again, spend time on your masks. My daughter, who's done some streaming, has said, her favorite saying used to be like, stay hydrated, gamers. And I feel like my favorite saying should be, spend time on your masks, photographers, because that's where you're living. And I'm just doing it quickly here, but give you a feel for it. Okay. So, oh, wow. That was a doozy. Okay. What is going on? All right. That was a good one. Let me try to undo. Okay. This brush has gotten away from me. Okay. Let's see here. Let me go back. Come on. What is happening here? It's like completely undone. So let's go into my history here. and trying to get this brush back. All right, it doesn't want to return. I've done it. I've broken the brushes. All right, let me try this again. Oh, this is really weird. I'm getting I've lost my brush panel. Oh, there we go. Okay, it's back. All right, so there's my wacky brush. Let me undo the let me undo these, and that'll get me quickly back to where I was. Delete brush 2. Okay, so now I can go back to we'll subtract, and we'll subtract this tree very quickly. Spend time on your masks, photographers. All right, and then we will do an add to punch up this a little bit, and I'm gonna do it quickly. All right, so punch that up, and I'd probably, I would typically, let me show you what I would really do. I'd probably zoom in a lot if I was spending more time, and I would start to work on the edges, so I would go to my, let's say my subtraction here, and I would work down these edges, and kind of, let's see here, which one of these was, that's part of the other thing you've got to be aware of when you're working with these is that the addition and subtraction gets kind of funky sometimes. So sometimes when you start to add and subtract a lot of these, you got to keep track of which ones are the additions and which ones are the subtractions. And sometimes erasing a subtraction adds, and it can be a little bit confusing. So just be aware of those things. All right, so let's get back to this. So I've got this image here, and now I can really punch up the emphasis on my subject now that I've got this highlighted, and I'm going to typically do that with texture and clarity. I might do a little bit of dehaze. Sometimes I'll do that with exposure. It just depends on, the image itself or contrast, but I'm trying to draw attention. In an image like this, I typically want to really create some separation between my subject and the background. So I'll want to use the mask, increase the detail, texture, clarity, contrast in the subject, and then maybe even do the reverse to the background. So I might take this and invert it so that I'm capturing the rest of the image, and then maybe subtract the sky so that I'm getting everything but the sky and but my subject here, and then I might do a little bit of negative clarity just to soften up the background just a little bit. You gotta be careful with this, but a little bit of that will create a lot of separation between your subject and the background. So sometimes when I've got a very busy background, like you've kind of got here, I mean, it's a nice background, but it's competing with the subject, I might do just a hint of negative clarity to kind of separate the two. Okay, so let's see. You might this is pretty good. Looking around at my edges here, see what other kind of distractions I have. So I think this is pretty good. Let's see what his edit looks like so we can compare. So, wow, again, another very strong edit. So different than what I ended up with, but perfectly, but a great edit. So cropped in much more closely on the subject, which I applaud that. That got rid of a lot of some of the, I mean, I kind of liked the path, but it definitely got rid of some of the busyness that was going on the left side. Probably might have white balanced on the tree to either get that white or maybe reduce the saturation, maybe definitely punched up the color in the subject itself here. So I really like the treatment of the subject. I think that's really nice. This is maybe a little too green for me around here, but that's a minor nitpick. But I really like the emphasis placed here with the color and how it separates from the tree. And I really like the cropping in. And that's another thing, if we talk about, that some of that color separation, that could happen through a desaturation. So if I come back to this version and I go up to this mask that's focused on the background, I could actually desaturate the background to remove some of that, some or all of that, to create some of that separation. So you could do a little bit of desaturation or a lot in order to get some of that. So think about your images and what's the focus. How do I create that contrast? Is it literally through contrast? Is it through the contrast of the color or color tones? Is it contrast through light and dark? There's all kinds of ways to create contrast or separation between your subject and the background. And sometimes a very subtle adjustment to some of these will do the trick. So very nice work here. I really like, let me switch back to this, to your version. I really like the punchiness of your subjects here and how they really stand out. So excellent work. So let's see. That was from Ross. Ross, thank you very much for sharing your images. I really appreciate it. All right, let me do a quick time check here. And as usual, I want to try to get through more that I've got today than covering time. So let me move it along here. Okay, so next up, so in one of the previous live streams, let me see here. So in one of the previous live streams, we had talked about portraiture and using different filters. And so Sue, who was here, talked about some of this, and we talked a little bit about portraiture. So she shared some images, and I want to share those with you. She said, I uploaded some examples of the demonic eyes, as we were talking about, as mentioned during the recent stream. Recently, I've been experimenting with an Earth URTH 720 nanometer filter under studio conditions using triggered flash, and sometimes the eyes are quite dark. I've left them in Photoshop format so that you can turn the eyes on and off. I rather like the look of the non-processed images, and the girls like the translucency of their skin. Image 0845 was taken in daylight and was given a channel swap, but it still looks pretty spooky. I'd be interested in hear your comments, Sue. Okay, Sue, thank you for sharing these images. So let me get these pulled up. We're going to look at these in Photoshop because she's got some layers with some different treatments of the eyes that we can take a look at. So let me just pull these up one at a time here, and we can take a look at these. And I will caveat this by saying that I am not the portraiture expert, but I can certainly share some of my perspectives on the infrared aspects of this. Okay, so let's take a look. Here is the first image, and you can see. So, and these are PSDs. So Sue has already done a white balance, which you can see on the skin. You can see how the skin turns very. There's a very clean look to the skin, although some might say it's a bit ghoulish. So this is something to consider when you're dealing with portraits. But the hair tends to turn this like soft blue normally, and then similar with the eyes. So let's first of all let's look at the eyes. And so this is with the eyes lightened. This is not the normal version. And if I remove this layer, you can see the original version of the eyes. And in fact, just for the sake of this discussion, let me zoom in a little bit so we can get a little bit closer look, so you can make sure that you're seeing these. So again, these are the treated, edited eyes, and then this is the original eyes. And you can see that, and I will say, eyes are very challenging to deal with. I've done some portraiture a little bit, and the eyes have a certain look. And I actually think one of the things we talked about is I don't think the color swap always looks very good when doing these. And so I actually like the treatment of the eyes. I think it creates a little bit more contrast and makes them a little bit sort of punchier. And I think it works better in an image like this. One of the things that we talked about in that last live stream, we had Tim here, who's Tim Weaver's an expert in infrared portraiture. And he was talking about makeup and what makeups work and don't work. My only feedback, and again, I say this as not a portrait person, but I definitely think that using the right makeup on the lips to make them a little bit darker, I think would make this look like a little bit more like a standard portrait and maybe not look so unusual. But the very, sort of white lips, I think is, to me, the one thing that stands out at this. I think that's almost more distracting than the eyes. I like the treatment of the eyes. I might look at either making the lips darker or looking at some of those makeup suggestions that Tim had for addressing the image. Okay, so let me pull up the next one. Let's see here. We'll just go through all of these. And this one, I really like this one because I think this one is a really effective use of infrared because it's leveraging the colors of the clothing, the contrast between the white boots and the black stockings and this patterned dress, I think makes for a really interesting combination. So this kind of thing works really well for infrared. Here is the original version. And then here's an adjustment to the eyes. So kind of bringing out the whites of the eyes a little bit more. Let me zoom into this one a little bit so we can see here. I definitely like the, again, because this is a wider shot, you know, adding a little more punch to the eyes definitely works. So that looks, I like the look of that. Let me move on to the next one. So let's see, we've got 4 total. Here is the next one. And so this one, I actually like, this one is really nice. I think you might have the same observation about the lips, but I think the composition is fantastic. The use of color is fantastic. I think this one works really well. This is the, let's see, this says original eyes. Let me take this mask off. Yeah, here's the, I think this is probably the original, and then this is the edit. So original, and you can see there's the irises look a little bit, you know, sort of ghostly is one of the things that happens with the irises. So that's one of the challenges. So this is the original, and then this is the edit. So I don't know. It's a tricky space. I think maybe, I don't know. I kind of like, maybe I would go somewhere in the middle. So maybe like take this to like maybe 50% of that, about 50% there. And so that to me, I think looks pretty good. Let me zoom out a bit. You're too close. So this is the original, and this is the edit. So I actually like the edit, but I might do it a little bit softer. And then I think the challenge here is just, you know, what happens with skin tone. That's definitely the big challenge you have when you're dealing with infrared and what it is doing to skin tones in portraits. And then finally, here is the version, the last one that is color swapped. So we'll take a look at this one. And so this is the color swap. You can see we've got a couple versions here. This is the color swap, and there's the eyes have been lightened. And then this is the original version. So you can see, you know, obviously she's done some other cleanup work with some of the foliage and stuff, but you can see how dark the eyes can be in natural light. I believe this is the one that was outdoors. Yep, this is the one that was outdoors. So you can see how dark the eyes can be even in direct sunlight. So that's definitely a challenge. And brightening them up is important. I'm mixed on the color swap, and I don't know. I kind of like the colors are okay, but I don't know. This is I'm out of my element here. I think that lightening the eyes is definitely an improvement here. But the color, I'm a better judge of color in landscapes and buildings than I am in people. But I definitely see where the challenges are when it comes to the eyes. So Sue, thank you very much for sharing those images. I really appreciate that. And it's very clear that you do have to do something to the eyes. And I think the makeup part, if I was going to spend more time in this, I think the makeup is something that I think would be really fascinating to get into. So it's very challenging. Shooting infrared portraiture is very challenging. Okay, so let me move on to next up here. Let's see. All right, so next up I have a question from Luke, and the question is, hi, I'm thinking of getting a Fuji X100F converted to full spectrum. I know I will have to put a filter on the front. Will the exposure time go up compared to a camera that's just a standard IR like a 590 nanometer? Thanks, Luke. I haven't done specific tests of exposure times comparing the different filters, like, full spectrum versus 590 versus 720. And the reason is because I haven't noticed a dramatic difference. When you take, let's say a 720 nanometer filter and put it on an unconverted camera, you're going to get long exposure times, 5 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. But if you have a 720 nanometer converted camera, you're actually going to get exposure times that are much closer to visible light photography. So you can handheld, and you have a lot more control. So if I think about the way that the light works, if you're shooting 720 nanometers, you're allowing a little bit of red light and a lot of near infrared light. If you change to a 590, for example, you're going to be letting in orange, red. You're letting in more light, so that's probably going to reduce the shutter times. And of course, if you go to full spectrum, it probably is the same thing. You're going to be letting in more light, and it will probably decrease the shutter speeds a little bit more. But again, I don't think it's a dramatic difference. You might be talking about, you know, a stop or two worth of differences. And in daylight, shooting infrared, you're going to end up with high shutter speeds anyway on a converted camera. So I just don't think it's going to matter that much. If you're shooting a converted camera, 590, 720, any of the common filters, you're probably going to be handheld. You're probably going to be able to shoot with a low ISO. If you're shooting in broad daylight, you'll probably have plenty of flexibility there. So there'll be slight differences in the shutter speed, but definitely not anything that I would be concerned about. The key difference is that the shutter speeds will be fast enough that you can shoot handheld. And then, you know, the only real challenge there is if you want to get into slowing things down and neutral density, and that's a whole nother subject. So I think I think if you convert, you know, the other thing to keep in mind is with the Fujifilm X100F, you might have a little bit of a hot spot on that lens. It's fixable though. I've seen images from that camera, so it's fixable. Definitely a nice camera to convert. Okay, so thank you, Luke, for sending that in. Now I have an image that I want to edit. Let's see here. So this is from, again, names. You guys are killing me with these names. I'll save myself by answering a question in the chat first from Peter. Which filter gives the best sharpness? I'm hearing the color IR filters are a bit softer than the 850 nanometer. So the challenge with the different filters really comes down to chromatic aberration. So the more colors you have, and this even applies to visible light, you know, shooting all the way from violets to reds, there's an extreme range of colors, and each color actually focuses differently. So the more colors in your range, the more the lens has to do its job of bringing those colors into a single plane. And this is why you tend to see chromatic aberration, which is that purple and green fringing at the edges of an image, that will happen. So the ways that you can avoid chromatic aberration, you can use like an APO lens, which they bring, you know, a typical achromatic lens will bring like two focuses, two wavelengths into a single focus of visible light, of course. When you bring in three with like an apochromatic, so an APO lens, you're going to bring three wavelengths into focus, and that's starting to bring in the infrared. The problem is that those tend to be both expensive. They tend to be zooms. You're not going to find those in a wide angle lens. So that's where some of that's one of the challenges you have with lenses and how they deal with these lights. So when you're looking at sharpness, part of the sharpness is how much are the different wavelengths being brought together into a single plane of focus. So because of that, technically, yes, you will get a sharper image by limiting the number of wavelengths that you're bringing in. Means there's less work to do. Once you focus, there's less work of the lens to do to bring different wavelengths together. The more you have, so if you're looking at a deep infrared filter like an 850, you're going to have the least amount of that, so you're going to have the most sharpness. If you try to do like a full spectrum, it's going to be harder to get them together. If you do a multi-spectral image where you're taking multiple images at different wavelengths and trying to blend them together, you're going to have a hard time lining up the focus on all of them. So that can be a factor. And so yes, that deep infrared, or infrared only, if you will give you the most sharpness for an image. So let's look at an image that was sent in by Almazochrome. I should You know, even when I try to figure out the pronunciations ahead of time, I still struggle. Almazochrome sent in an image, and let's take a look at that. So let me pull that up. And I think that that's a raw image. So we'll take a quick look at editing that. Here we go. Oh yes, this is a very nice image. So let me switch over here and bring this up. So we've got this lovely image here. Looks like we could see if there was any color in it, but we've got this very stark image. This was shot with a Nex 3N camera. Let's go over to the develop module. This might have been, I'm not getting any metadata about the lens, so this might have been like a vintage lens. Is it a vintage lens? Is it interchangeable lens camera? I'm not sure. Let's reset this, and I'll switch to color briefly just so we can see. So this looks like it might be, this is probably a 720 nanometer image, because if I white balance on the clouds, you can see just a hint of gold in the sky, and you've got just a hint of baby blue. So you could definitely process this as a color image. Let's just do that quickly. I like the thought of this as black and white, but let's just do a quick color process so you can see the kind of thought process that goes into an image like this. So it's subtle because of the 720. The colors are not dramatic. So for example, if I take this red-blue channel mixer splitting the green channel, even here I'm not seeing a lot of color, and there's not much in the sky. And of course, this is very overcast. And so when I look at an image like this and I'm trying to decide whether I want to process it as color or black and white, I'm thinking, what can I really get out of it as color? And of course, if you're shooting 720 nanometers, you're probably not expecting to get a lot of color in the first place. It's a more subdued look. So there's, you could theoretically bring up the color here, but I because of what's going on in the sky, I do think this makes more sense as a monochrome image. So this is just the soft tones in this are very lovely. I would probably, the challenge though is that creating some contrast between this and the background. Look at this histogram. I mean, wow, you've got like everything's in this very narrow band. So the amount of contrast in this image, there's just not much. There's not much going on here. Let me crank up the contrast a little bit, maybe even do a tone curve, see what I can get out of this. I'll go up to strong. But you know what I'm probably going to do in an image like this is I want to create some separation between the tree and the background. So let's go into the masks, and I'm going to do a subject, and we'll roll the dice here on the select subject and see what kind of a mask we can get. Let's see here. Oh, and Peter says, thanks, learning infrared has the side benefit of improving my understanding of regular photography. Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. It's improved my visible light photography tremendously. Understanding, it's forced me to learn concepts that I didn't think I'd have to care about, especially color. Learning about color and being more fearless about color has made my visible light photography much better. So I really enjoy that as well. So now that I've got this tree selected, I might want to figure out how to maybe a little bit more exposure, darker. You could go either way. You could either try to make it darker or you could try to make it lighter. I might try to go lighter. It's going to be tricky to get a clean mask, with an edge like this. So that's going to be tricky no matter what you do. If I invert this to grab the rest of the image, I could make the rest of it slightly darker. You got to be really careful with this. With these kind of adjustments, I probably wouldn't go more than maybe a third of a stop in either direction. That's about a third of a stop. That's a little more than a third. Let's take it down to a third. Sometimes I'll just very commonly just type 0.33 to get my number in. Okay, so that's a good start. I really like this image. I like the sort of high key look of it and the sort of the delicate look of it. Maybe you could go in and let's see, we could do a little bit of a brush on maybe the trunk. You could bring out a little bit more detail on the trunk, maybe. Could be interesting. Just a little bit. We'll just do a little bit of contrast and texture and clarity to just maybe a hint of dehaze just to create a little bit of punch there for that. I might do the same for the tree itself. go to the tree. Oops, just my navigator. And go to the tree and just add maybe experiment with a little texture and clarity just to try to figure out how to add some a little bit of depth to that. So that creates a little bit of separation with the background. So this is an image where I think subtlety, you can use the subtlety to your benefit. I might go through and clean up some of the stuff in the foreground here to try to clean the look of this image. So maybe get rid of some of this stuff, maybe this thing, some of these rocks, clean up some of these edges, to try to remove distractions. I mean, I don't mind the ridges in the sand, but maybe remove some of these distractions to bring the focus to your subject a little bit. So the other thing you can do is zoom out a little bit. Something I like to do in an image sometimes is just zoom out a little bit, try to take the whole thing in, make sure I'm seeing it as a whole. That's another way to get another view of an image, take another look at it. But this is a very lovely image. I really like the, so much of my infrared is focused on adding contrast because there's sometimes so little contrast in infrared. It's there, you just got to really bring it out in the editing. But it's very nice to see an image where you could have a strong impact without having to add a ton of contrast. So I really like this image. So thank you so much for sharing this image. Very nice. And again, that was an image from Almazochrome. So thank you very much for sharing that image. Okay. Next up, we have some images. We have an image from Joel, which is 2 questions. Let's see here. Joel says, I occasionally get a horizontal light spot when shooting with an unconverted camera and a Hoya R72 filter using the same lens camera combination. I don't always get this effect. Is this a lens flare from the filter? What can I do to ensure that I don't get this effect? And number 2, is there a 590 nanometer filter for an unconverted camera? Let's answer that one first, and then I'll answer that while I'm pulling up the image from Joel. Let's see, look. So is there a 590 nanometer image for a unconverted camera? No, there is not. I've seen many people try. You can try. What you will get is the 590 nanometer filter will allow orange and red light to pass. You'll get a full blast of orange and red light. And then that hot mirror filter that's built into the camera is going to prevent much infrared from getting in. So what you end up with is basically an orange and red image. It's very red. You can't white balance it. You can't do anything with it. I suppose theoretically there is there's some scenario where an orange and red image looks good, but I haven't seen one yet. So basically the answer is no, you cannot use a 590. You really can't use any filter lower than about a 720 nanometer wavelength cutoff with an unconverted camera. That's the realm of converted cameras. With unconverted cameras, you can shoot 720 and you can shoot higher numbers. Of course, into the 800s, now you're looking at some extreme shutter speeds, some exposure times. I've shot with an unconverted camera with an 830 nanometer filter, and the shutter times are like 3 to 5 minutes. So definitely going to need a tripod, and it's going to have a big impact. So let's take a look at this image. Let me pull this image up, and we'll take a look at this image. And this is interesting. So this was shot on a Nikon D810 with a Tamron SP35 1.4. Ooh, very wide aperture. This image from Joel. Okay, so let's flip over and take a look at that. I'm seeing a very strong streak through the middle, which to me kind of looks like a light leak. But let's play around with this a little bit more and see. So let's pick up the infrared temp profile, and I'm going to white balance. I get crazy colors, but that's okay. I'm going to white balance on the clouds. Now I'm getting white clouds, and I think I'm getting some light blues in the trees here, but it's really hard to tell. So if I look at this line, I mean, you can if you zoom in on this, you can see this is really blue. This is really blue, and it's not just this line. It's actually like a whole bar. If you zoom out, you can kind of see it differently. It's almost like a whole bar from here to here that goes across. This really looks like a light leak to me. And that's unusual because with a circular filter, you would typically get, a very tight seal. This is why you don't see square filters for infrared, is because you need that light seal with the lens, because any visible light that gets in could basically corrupt this. It's also interesting, this may be unrelated, but I am seeing like a little bit of vignetting that looks like it's from your filter around the edges of the image here. That could either be that you're stepping down to a filter that's smaller and you're seeing that, and so that's expected and you're fine with that, or that could be that the filter isn't screwed on tight enough and there's light leaks coming in. Now that's interesting with a threaded filter. I mean, you have to be pretty loose to get a light leak, I think. But that's what this really looks like. This looks like some kind of light leak. And of course, that's going to be because you have, on an unconverted camera, because you have that hot mirror filter in the camera, it's going to block infrared and even the smallest amount of visible light that is able to get through that filter or around that filter is going to create a light leak. And that's what this really looks like. And if you're using a Hoya, I think you said you're using a Hoya R72, that's a great filter. So I doubt that it's related to the filter. I would check and make sure that it's screwed on tight and make sure that you have a good seal. And if you're using rings, I would check those as well, because it looks to me like you have a light leak. This does not look like, I mean, there could be a hot spot in here, but it would be very faint, and I don't really see much of a hot spot. Lewis in the chat said a light leak through the viewfinder. That is interesting. That could very well be with a D810 is a DSLR, so there could be light coming through the viewfinder, which could actually get in. So if you've got a tight seal on the lens, good call, Lewis, that could be what the cause is. So you might have to put a little tape or a little cloth over the optical viewfinder to do that, or you could simply lock the mirror up. Go into the menu settings and lock the mirror up, and then use that to prevent any light from coming through. And so that would be a good way to do it. That's probably what it is. Make sure, check out this issue with the filter to make sure that's set, and then check the optical viewfinder to make sure you're not leaking light. Another consideration if you have a DSLR, another way for light to get in. So excellent question, and thanks, Lewis, for chiming in there. That's very helpful. Let's see here. So that was from Joel. Thank you, Joel, very much for sending in your question. Let's see here. I've got one more set of a couple more questions, and then one more set of images. So let's see. I don't know if Anshul is here, but we're finally getting to your images. If you're here, thank you so much for being patient. Let's see. A quick question from Peter. I'm considering to trade in my 695 nanometer, I'm guessing converted Fuji XS10 for a full spectrum Canon R series, but worried about the Canon R's infrared issue with some of the RF lenses. Any guidance? The challenge with the Canons are just going to be the limit of the lenses that are available. You're not going to have as many lenses to pick from. And so, I mean, that's a big factor. I'm not as familiar with the lenses that are available, but I know that Canon doesn't like third-party lenses, or they limit those, and so that can be challenging. And of course, lens selection is pretty important. When I originally switched from Canon to Fuji, not only did I was shooting infrared at the time, and not only did I look at the systems and compare those, but I actually did a list of lenses. Like if I switch to Olympus, what lenses would I get? If I switch to Fuji, what lenses would I get? If I switch to Sony, what lenses would I get? Because that was a factor, because I was starting to shoot more infrared. So I don't know that there's an easy answer there, except do the research, see if there are lenses that are good for infrared that would meet your criteria before making a body switch, because the lenses are a pretty important factor when shooting infrared, and you want to make sure that the system you're on supports it. I've seen lots of great infrared photography from Canon R cameras, like for people who send images in for filters. So I know that the lenses are out there. I just don't know which ones they are specifically. Okay, so let's get into these images from Anshul. So Hey, Rob, I submitted 2 images, one full spectrum and one with a 720 nanometer filter. I know there are a lot of things that can be improved about the framing and composition, but in this particular instance, I'm looking for advice or suggestions on the editing side of things. I had to submit white balance corrected TIFF raw files because I couldn't keep the camera raw files with me. Oh my goodness. I'm shocked and stunned. On a side note, I enjoy the book. Thanks. Oh, thank you so much for picking up the book. All right, so let's take a look at your images here. Let me pull those up. If I can get over the fact that you no longer have the raws and you're limited to the TIFFs. I'm just teasing with you. Let's see here. So we've got this is another case where you've been so kind enough to send in both a JPEG of your edit and a raw version, so I can take a look at the raw. So let's do that. Let me pull up the the raw version. We'll start with there, and then we'll compare what I did to your image. Okay, so let me switch over here. So we're now in Lightroom, and it looks like you were shooting a Sony a6000 with a 55 to 210 lens. All right, so let's take a look here, and I think you said this was a 720 nanometer filter. So let me switch over to the develop module and fit to screen. So the first thing that I'll do, you're right. This is, as you said, you mentioned this and I forgot. So you mentioned this as a TIFF, so meaning you already did a white balance. So I don't really need to worry about a white balance per se. What I can do is, let's see here. I can click on the profile and I can still use my JPEG. So with the with the Lightroom color swap profiles, I include typically versions that are camera specific that will work and will both do a color swap and a temperature shift. But I also include JPEG ones that would work with any image that you can use. So I'll pick one of those. Let's see. You say, for context, the frames had dragonflies and bees all over, so I took multiple pictures and stacked them to get rid of all the distractions. Okay, well, that makes perfect sense. That's a very good reason. It's not like you threw the raws away. So thank you for sharing. And I was just teasing anyway. I'm, to each his own. So let's look at some different colors here. So we've got the hue, kind of a darker sky, invert. You've got a bit of a teal sky, and this is selective. What do you like with an image? Obviously, we're going to have more of a white foliage in this image because of the color balance selections that were already made. So it's basically different colors that you're looking at here. So let's take this color. I like the channel mixer split with the green channel. It gives me what I think is a realistic sky. So now let's do a quick edit. I'm not going to probably touch the sky too much. Let me look around the image. So I'm going to take just the general exposure and play with it. I'm going to focus on a little bit of more exposure. I want a good exposure for the trees here in the middle. The next thing that I'm going to do in an image like this is kind of look at the shadows. And there's two approaches. You could either just bring the shadows up. That's one approach. But I actually would probably rather address that with a mask. So let me take a linear gradient and I'm going to draw up here. You could do it here. You could add more to it. But I think this will give me a good approximation of kind of what I'm looking at. And then from here, I could still do a shadow increase, but I'm gonna first do a little bit of an exposure bump because I want to pull out a little bit more detail. Sometimes, even 2/3 of a stop. When I get a good reflection like this, I usually like to lift up the exposure a little bit and bring out more detail in the reflection. It depends on the image, but I really like the look of that. And so that might mean bringing up the exposure a little bit. Maybe if I like a full stop would get me pretty close to matching the exposure above the water. But to each his own. That's pretty good. Let me just go. I'll go one stop straight up. So I like the look of that, and I probably don't need to lift the shadows too much because then I would start to really lose some of the contrast. So now that I've got that, I'm starting to like the look of that. Let me go back to let me do some global adjustments here. So let's pick up the contrast as a whole. I will maybe add a little bit of a tone curve there. Let's do a little bit of texture and clarity. Now, if I had clouds in an image like this, and I probably still could like mask to not do it globally, but just focus on the trees. But in this case, I've got no clouds, so it's maybe not too big of a deal. Um, and now I might, maybe you could look at different parts of the image. So where do I want to focus on this? That's kind of a tricky one. You've got a little bit of a kind of a bright spot here. You could keep that, or I could just maybe do a little brush and drop the exposure slightly to kind of get it to blend more. Or I could look at different elements. Maybe I want this tree to stand out here in the middle. So maybe I wanted to add, a little bit. I'm going to do a super fast brush. Oh, no, that was on the same layer here. Let me undo that and add a new layer. Brush. I'll zoom in a little bit. So maybe I want this tree to stand out a little bit more because this is kind of the one dominant, element that I have here. So maybe and plus this one, but that one's really in the shadows. So if I could come in here, maybe I could pick up the contrast, or you could darken it a little bit, play around with some of the details. So this is the kind of processing that I would do in an image like this, is to really, I might not do much with the sky aside from getting the color that I want, but I would probably play around with different elements, and I would probably spend a lot of time in the reflection. So let's take a look at your version. So somewhat similar. You've got a blue sky, which looks pretty good, maybe a little bit more saturated. It doesn't look like maybe any dramatic, changes to the water here. And you've got, the eye is drawn to this row of trees. Again, there's no right or wrong here. I think the answer really comes down to where do you want the viewer's eye to look? And do you want it to be focused on the trees? Do you want it to be focused on the reflection? You've kind of got some lines coming in from the tree line at the top and the tree line in the water that are kind of creating some interesting lines. But that's the question that I would think about is where do you want the eye to be drawn in an image like this? For me personally, I might put a little more emphasis in the water. Okay, let's take a look at, let me pull your other image up. Let's see, I'll find that's the JPEG. So let me look at the RAW. Pull that up. So this is the same camera, the Sony a6000, with a Samyang 12 millimeter. That's interesting. I think I've shot with a Samyang or a Rokinon 12 millimeter, and I've seen more f-stops, more hotspots that you're not seeing here. So I don't know if you've corrected those, but that was always a challenge for me with that lens. Let's see. So some comments, those adjustments for balancing the viewer's focus really made a big difference, and I haven't done anything in that line of thinking in any of my edits yet. So definitely something to keep in mind. So looking at this next image, I can't help myself but play around with the white balance. Do you like that? Do you like that sort of, let me just reset this, make sure I'm looking. So there's the original, maybe, a little bit of a yellow cast, which might be good if you want to create sort of a golden hour look, or you could white balance on the clouds and get more of a white look. I mean, the choice is yours. You could really go either way. Let's start with let me start the edit with this look, and then maybe we'll come back to it. So it looks like this might be let's see, I'm trying to remember. Did you say this was a chrome? Oh, this is full spectrum. Full spectrum. Full spectrum is pretty challenging. I found it very challenging to shoot in full spectrum and get good colors. You've got some pretty decent colors here. The sky looks really good, and you've got some interesting color here in the foliage. So I'm kind of impressed with what you've been able to do here. I've maybe it's the subject. I'm going to pull up the shadows here a little bit, but I've really struggled to figure out how to get a good look when shooting in full spectrum. I want to do more. I want to experiment more with full spectrum and figure out how to get a better look. But this is actually quite good. This is almost a little bit more. Maybe it's the subject, but it's almost a bit more like an IR Chrome type filter. So I'm actually impressed with what you've been able to get out of this. Comment, hotspots with this lens appear with a filter, not when shooting full spectrum. Oh, well, that would definitely explain it, because I think when I used that lens, I probably only did it with a filter. Let's see here. What else would I do here? So, I mean, much like an IR Chrome image, I mean, I think you've got, this image looks pretty good as is. The only thing that you might consider, you could definitely, you might, pick the tree, and maybe I might try to increase the brightness of the tree a little bit. It's just a little bit too dark for my taste. So let me see if I can get if I can get lucky. I got lucky with the select subject. So maybe I just nudge up the exposure just a smidge. You got to be really careful with fringing when you do that too much. So I'm just go a third of a stop just to give it a little bit more edge. I think I'm going to probably do a linear gradient from the bottom up, and just probably draw down the exposure just ever so slightly in the foreground, just a hair, like again, a third of a stop, just to sort of bring the eye up towards the center of the image. And then the other thing that you could do with this is I could look at, if you come down to HSL, you could play around with the HSL panel because you've got kind of a distinct color. You could do this with a mask. You could do a color range mask, but I think it might even be easier to do in here. You could increase the saturation, or I could come into hue, grab the picker here, and then play around with the colors. So the color you had is good, but I mean, if you wanted to play with the color a bit, like, if you want to get in a little bit, this is kind of a cool color. So that's kind of interesting. So I kind of like that. Let me play around with the saturation a little bit. If you crank it up, it really gets to be a lot. I'm going to bring up the luminance just a hair. So I think that with an image like this, you can really benefit from HSL because you're going to be targeting those colors specifically. You don't even need to worry about a mask. Now, if you did, going back to our discussion on color balance, if you wanted to bring this back a little bit for more of a, golden hour. I'm forgetting the term because I don't shoot visible light enough. If you wanted more of a golden hour light look, Mr. midday full sun shooter. If you want more of that golden hour look, then you could definitely tweak the white balance a little bit more to the yellow. I think it's I might do it a little bit here. A little bit's interesting. I mean, going back to where it was at 0 might be more than I think is good, but I think a little bit of it, just a hint of it, could be interesting. So that's where I would end up with an image like this. If we didn't focus too much on cropping or composition, that's what I would do with the colors. I suppose I could, maybe try to, you've got such a great sky here. I didn't think about the sky because it's already so good. Let me see if I could punch it up just a smidge more though, with some dehaze. So a little bit more. But again, I think you've got a really good sky here, so it doesn't really need it like a lot of infrared images do, probably because it's full spectrum. So that would be my take on this image. Let's take a look at what you had. So 1 second here. So I like, in your version, I like the color selection. I'm a big fan of non-traditional skies like cyan, not cyan, like teal skies. I really like teal skies. And I love the red in this. So I really like the colors that you've selected in your version. And maybe the clouds are a little bit whiter, but I love sort of the non-traditional colors. So I really like what you've done here. So this is the version that I had. I would still brighten up the foreground a little bit and the tree maybe to make it a little brighter. It's still a little bit dark in the original. But that would be my only real comment. Aside from that, I love the colors that you've made there. So very nice images. Thank you so much for sharing those. I really appreciate it. Okay, so let me see here. Trying to wrap up here. I've got just a couple more things left, and then I get caught up on all the submissions everybody's made. Man, it's been so amazing, all the submissions that everybody's sent in. Let's see. So a question here. from Sebastian. I went out and tried some infrared photography using my unconverted Canon EOS 5D Mark III with a 24 to 105 millimeter f4 IS and an older EF 20 to 35 millimeter f2.8 with a HIDA, so that's a filter name, HAIDA, 720 nanometer infrared filter attached. How does an accurately exposed IR image look? What should the histogram look like? Is it the same as normal photography? Should I focus on the autofocus, manual focus with live view, or measure the distance without the filter on and set it to the red numbers on the lens? Is the filter any good? Should I shoot the ISO or shorten the exposure time with a high ISO because such as 800? So let's step through each one of these. So how does an accurately exposed infrared image look? So in some ways, it's going to look the same as a regular image. You're going to have, especially if you look at the histogram in your editor will look similar to a visible light image, especially after you've set a white balance and done a rendition. Now, the thing to be aware of is that sometimes in cameras, the exposure meter and the histogram, they don't understand the infrared coming in, and they get a little wonky. So sometimes the exposures can be off a little bit. You got to be careful not to overexpose images with some cameras, and you've got to keep an eye. You'll get used to with your camera. There's no hard and fast rule here, but definitely it's going to be a little bit different. So, but keep an eye on it. Make sure you're not exposing to the right, because you're probably going to blow out your image for sure. So that's something to keep an eye on. The histogram is useful, but again, I wouldn't trust it 100% in camera until you get comfortable with what it looks like, and then you've seen the images in your editor. I would trust the histogram in your editor because it's gonna, after the colors are changed, it's gonna be more manageable. Should I focus with the autofocus, manual focus with live view, or measure the distance without the filter and set the measured focus to the red numbers? So the red numbers he's referring to, on some lenses, there'll be red focus lines. On some, there'll be something called an infrared index mark, which is a red dot or red line that indicates where the focus should go in infrared. The challenge with using that was really designed for film shooting particularly with older lenses. That was designed for shooting on film, and let's see. The distances aren't going to be accurate. So infrared light focuses at a different distance than visible light does. So the distance between your subject and your lens, the focus is going to be different. The infrared index mark is designed to accommodate that with infrared film that and typically using like a 720 nanometer filter. But it's not going to be perfectly accurate. The way to get focus is to use live view. If you have a DSLR, do not use the optical viewfinder for focus. It will be wrong. It is calibrated for visible light, unless you have a lens that's specifically calibrated for that. But that limits that. You can only do that with one lens. Stick to live view. You can use whatever tools are available. I'm a fan of focus peaking. You can punch in, use whatever focus assist you have, but use the live view to be able to zoom in and get the focus that you want. That's going to get you the most accurate focus, more accurate than the infrared index marks even. So that's a good way to go. Is the HIDA filter any good? No, it's terrible. There are a couple filters that people have sent me repeatedly images of. The HIDA is one, and the Earth is the other. Actually, Susan mentioned that in her images. Although I think so, with a converted camera, you have more flexibility with what I call bad filters. Bad filters are ones where a good filter has a really sharp curve at the point you indicate. So if you get a filter from a reputable brand, Hoya, Tiffin, Kalari, LifePixel, B+W. These are high quality filters that are going to give you a nice clean cutoff. They'll work well with an unconverted camera. A bad filter has a sloppy cutoff. I should do a video about this. They have a kind of a sloppy cutoff, and the problem is that a bad 720 filter on an unconverted camera just lets too much visible light in, and then it makes it hard to white balance. You get greens in there. It's not good. So these cheap filters they can work with a converted camera because you have that sort of flexibility, but they're just terrible with unconverted. So I would strongly recommend that you switch to a well-known brand like the ones I mentioned earlier: Hoya, B+W, Tiffin, LifePixel, Kalari. That's going to get you a high quality filter, and you will avoid the headache. It's not worth, but a filter is not worth cheaping out on. I've seen so much headache that it causes for people. So definitely get a good filter. Should I shoot low ISO or shorten the exposure time with higher ISO, such as 800, because Lightroom now has the possibility to reduce noise? That entirely depends upon your camera. The challenge with shooting, and 800 is probably not bad. The challenge with shooting higher ISOs in an unconverted camera is going to be noise. So you're already looking at the challenge of a longer exposure, 5 to 20 seconds or something, for an unconverted camera. And if you're gonna get a little bit of color noise as a result. You're just going to, because of the longer exposure. If you increase the ISO, then you have the chance to increase that color noise and make it more challenging to recover. The tools are obviously getting a lot better for noise recovery, so it may be okay, but I would probably argue that it's still better to keep as low of an ISO as you can. It's going to depend on your subject. If you've got a tripod, and if you're saying the difference is the difference between like a 5-second exposure and a 30-second exposure, and your subject isn't moving, well, then take the longer exposure. It's worth the lower noise floor. You might want to do some tests though. The noise tools are getting pretty amazing these days. And they may account for that, but just remember, it's not just the ISO noise you're dealing with. It's also the long exposure noise, and the fact that you're trying to sort of break through this hot mirror filter is creating a challenge. So thank you, Sebastian, for sending in your questions. I really appreciate it, and good luck. Shooting with an unconverted camera, you can get spectacular results, but the quality of the filter is really important. So it looks like I've got an image that was just submitted tonight from Dennis. Let me see. He says, I'm trying to use, let me see here. Oops. Just doing a quick time check. I'm trying to use Capture One or Darktable, but getting no luck on the proper color swap. So I'm going to see if I can take a look at your images. I don't know that I have time to pull them up in Darktable and explore them that way, but let me just see if I can quickly import them into Lightroom and see what we're looking at here, as opposed to trying to make it wait till the next live stream. Let me see if I can find them here quickly. So give me 1 second while I import them. Here we go. And come on, Lightroom, you can do it. Where are the images? Oh, here they are. I think, let me check the file names. They might not have been moved into the right folder yet. Yep, these are yours, 2477. Okay. All right, let me open these up quick. We'll see if we can do a quick diagnosis here and see if what these look like. So let me import these. And so while I'm waiting for these to import, let me check the chat. Let's see. I'd like to see a tutorial on how to fix hotspots. Thank you, Lewis. I'm getting to the end here tonight. I've discussed this in my last live stream, so you might want to check that. I've also done 2 videos on addressing hotspots. There was a video. So if you do a search on YouTube, there's a video on fixing hotspots explicitly. And then there's another video on shooting with a mobile phone, which you may not be interested in. Even if you're not interested in the mobile phone part, there's an interesting bit in there on dealing with hotspots. So and then using doing corrections with hotspots and then saving them as presets so you can reuse like a mask that you can reuse, because the hotspots tend to be the similar from image to image. And so check those out. Those are great sources. So let's see here. I'm pulling up your image now, and it looks like you said you had 570, and I wonder what is that? I'm wondering if that's a typo, or if that is, if it was actually a 590, maybe. I guess there could be a 570 nanometer filter out there, and then a 720. Let's see. Okay, let me pull these up and share them. Here is the first one. So this, we'll look at this. This was shot with a Fujifilm X Pro 3. This is the 18 millimeter lens. And let's get over to the develop module, and let me see what you've got going on here. I'm gonna guess that this was, before I do anything, I'm gonna take a guess that this was shot with a 590 or your 570 nanometer filter on an unconverted camera, because that's kind of what it looks like. But let's dive in a bit and see, because I'm seeing lots of orange and red, like we talked about earlier. If you use a 590 nanometer filter on a unconverted camera, you're just going to get a lot of orange and red. So let's pick up the color temp. Yeah, if I white balance on this, so just white balancing on this, you can see, I can see I'm getting a flood of green here, and so this suggests to me that you're basically getting, you know, even before I even make this adjustment, if I go back to this view, or go back to, rather, let me go back to this filter, you can even see here that we're just getting a lot of these colors. Let me check the other image, because you said one of them was a 720, so theoretically, even with a 720, you should be okay. This one, I guess it depends on the filter. This is interesting because I'm getting a better white balance on the foreground here, but I'm still getting green in the trees, which leads me to believe that this is a 720 nanometer filter, but maybe a lower quality one, because let me just up the exposure. It's letting in this, you get this green. Typically, it's very unusual to see green, even after a white balance, with a good filter. So I'm going to take a guess here based on what you've submitted, and I'm going to say that this image was taken with the 570 nanometer filter, and that it was probably on an unconverted camera, so that's just not going to work. You're not going to get good results. And then this was probably taken with a lower quality filter. And so I would probably check your filter quality, invest in a Hoya or one of the other brands I talked about earlier, and you're going to get much better results. And the results are going to be more predictable, and you're not going to have to deal with the challenges of these low-cost filters. I get very frustrated. I get people sending me images all the time using these low-cost filters, like the two brands I named earlier. And I don't know where they get their images that they're claiming when they show the sample images on their product pages. I don't know how they're shooting those. I don't think it's possible with those filters, because they're just junk. So that would be my suggestion here, would be to get a better filter. All right. I'm going to wrap up here shortly. Looks like Anne's got a question in the chat. Could I use a B+W 695 nanometer, which is the 092 filter infrared, on a non-converted camera, or will it not work well? Oh, you're probably on the border. That's a tough one. So the challenge here is that the different I would try it. I might be willing to try it with a B+W, because it's a very good quality, and they tend to have a very clean cutoff in their filters. But the challenge is you're going to be letting in a lot of light. One of the challenges in this space is that different filter manufacturers will measure their wavelength differently. So if you look at one of these curves, you know, the curve might start allowing light at, like, say, I don't know, let's say it's a 720 nanometer filter. It's actually starting to let in light at like 680. And the 720 represents the midpoint, where it's letting in 50% of the light, and then it continues to curve up to allow maximum transmission. And so they're calling it a 720, but you got to remember it's a gradation. A higher quality filter like a B plus W, great quality filters, or Hoyas, they're going to have that sharp line, and you tend to trust the numbers they're giving you a little bit more. The lower quality filters, I don't trust the numbers at all, especially if they're not willing to share a transmission curve. But like if you go to Hoya, B plus W, Kalari, Life Pixel, Tiffin, they're going to share. You can find the transmission curves and you can see what I'm talking about. A 695, I don't know. That's tough because that might just be letting in too much red light on an unconverted camera. Typically, the recommendation for an unconverted camera is to stick with a 720 nanometer filter or a 740. Like for example, Tiffin has a 740 nanometer filter, which is pretty similar, but it's not going to let in a lot of visible light. A 695 might let in a little bit too much. I'd have to see. I'd have to test. I don't think I have that filter. I've got the 093, which is the 830 nanometer version, but I don't know if I have I might have the I might have the 092, but I don't think I've tried it on an unconverted camera. So I can't tell you specifically it's going to work or not. I have a little bit more faith in B plus W filters, but that wavelength is still on the low end and you might get a little bit too much red in your image. So that's my thoughts there. So let's wrap up for today. I want to thank everybody who stopped by. Thank you for all of the submitted questions and the submitted images. Thank you for stopping by the chat. I really appreciate everybody participating and asking questions. Again, if you haven't, take a look at my book at infraredbook.com. It is 320 pages and just chock full of information broken up by subject. So if you have a specific question, you can find it pretty quickly. You can get information about filters and conversions and all kinds of stuff. So check this out at infraredbook.com. And if you want any other information, let me pull up some links that'll be helpful to you. So we'll take a look at some of these. So you can get the book at infraredbook.com. You can get the schedule for future live streams at 590.red/live. And I'll pick another date here in the future, and we'll set up another session and give you all an opportunity to send in more images. And if you're looking for any other information, like the infrared profile pack for shifting your color temperature, or the Lightroom color swap profiles, or lenses, lens selections, a whole variety of information you can get from my blog at 590.red/blog. So thanks everybody for stopping by. Good luck to you on your infrared photography journey, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.